Hello, everyone. Welcome to VSPG. Today we're hearing from Professor Nicolas Roberts on the secret life of a Paleoarchean granitic dome, the cryptic internal structure of the Mt Edgar Dome, East Pilbara Terrane, and the hints it provides about the formation of early continental crust. Pretty different than what we've been having recently, so we're excited to have a change of pace. Andre, you want to go ahead and introduce Nick for us, please?
Sure. It's a pleasure to introduce Nick Roberts, and just a few words before when we started with seminar series, we wanted to include talks on tectonics and plate tectonics in early time, but very soon we realized that it was very difficult to find people doing field geology on early Archean stuff, and especially from plate tectonic perspective. So in that sense, it's great to have Nick here, who I presume will be talking about this aspects. So Nick did his undergraduate in Carleton College in Minnesota. Many people came from there, and some spoke already in this series. And then he continued with PhD in University of Wisconsin-Madison, working with Basil Tykov. And I guess during his PhD, he started to work on Archean in East Pilbara, and he continued with it during his postdoc, staying again in the University of Madison, and he's now assistant professor at Hamilton College in New York. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Nick, and take it from here.
Great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to be sharing work that I've been working on for the past 6 or 7 years in the East Pilbara Terrane. I always start these talks with this image, which is a gamma ray spectrometry flyover imagery from the Geological Survey of Western Australia. And it's been colored for percent potassium. And so this is a kind of aerial view of the Pilbara Craton colored by a potassium composition. And this is the image that first got me kind of motivated to study the Mt Edgar Dome. You can see that there are some internal structures to the dome. And I got really interested in finding a way where we could more quantitatively look at the 3D fabrics that were in this dome, and then beginning to think about what that internal structure might mean. I also have done quite a bit of work here in the Warrawoona Hills, which is part of the Marble Bar Greenstone Belt. And although I'm not going to focus on any of that stuff today, it does kind of come into play with my broader thinking of the tectonics of this Paleoarchean terrain. So before I get started, I have more collaborators than this that are involved, but these are the kind of ones that are directly involved with the stuff that I'm talking about today. So my PhD advisor, Basil Tykov, and Jeff Vervoort, they were the PIs on the NSF grant that kind of got this work started. Ross Salerno, who did his PhD at Washington State and is now a Mendenhall Fellow at the USGS, did all of the garnet petrochronology. And then I have 2 students who we went to Western Australia last summer to continue this work. So Veronica and Xavier are current students of mine. All right, so for me, the big questions that I'm going to either answer or partially answer or kind of just guess at in this talk are, 1, what's the internal structure of the Mt Edgar Dome and when did it form? 2, under what general conditions did these structures form? And I'm mostly talking about temperature in that case. What are the kinematics of that deformation? So if we know the structures, we want to know some sense of flow that those structures are associated with. And then what does this overall structure tell us about the state of the crust at the end of the Paleoarchean? And to do that, the talk overview, I'm going to start with some background. I know that this talk is going to be quite different from a lot of the talks that you're giving in that it's very field-based, very structural geology-based. I'm going to present a couple types of data. Mostly I'm going to focus on anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility data. And that's for the whole dome, but I'm going to zoom into these two areas that are outlined in a white box, and look at structure there a little more carefully. And then I'm also going to add, we're just starting to do some more microstructural work, so some crystallographic preferred orientation and vorticity analysis that are computed from electron backscatter diffraction data to get at that flow question. And finally, just for fun, I'll talk about my current thinking in whether plate tectonics was active during this time, or maybe not, or maybe we can't say. Spoiler alert, I'm not about to rock the world here. So the answer is kind of maybe, but we don't know. All right, so jumping in, the Pilbara Craton is located in the northwest corner of Western Australia, and you can see the granitic rocks of the Pilbara Craton and the overall dome-and-keel architecture of the Pilbara Craton from space. So it's really quite spectacularly exposed. And it's really not been significantly modified, especially in terms of when we're talking about like ductile processes. Not really been modified since the Archean. And so therefore, it's kind of a special place on Earth where it's a window into the early Earth that is relatively unobtruded by other later processes. So the Pilbara Craton has several different component parts. I'm going to focus today on the East Pilbara Craton, which is a piece of continental crust, proto-continental crust that's 3.5 to 3.2 billion years, with a few younger elements in it. All of this gray surrounding the Pilbara Craton, that's the Fortescue and Hammersley Basin. So that's kind of the what in the Archean we would call the cover sequence over this Paleoarchean terrane. And in the red here are the granitic domes. And then there you can see the East Pilbara supracrustal sequence, Warrawuna group, Kelly group, Sulfur Springs group, that kind of drape those domes. On the left here, you see a picture of the view from the Warrawuna Hills in the southwest margin of the dome, and you're looking at the Mt Edgar Dome. So just to give you a sense of what these look like, they're completely vast expanses of flat exposure of granitic rocks, and then the greenstones that surround them, they're subvertically tilted. So they're the greenstones have been deformed to be parallel with the dome margin, right at the margin. So these are really massive, almost kind of bathylitic style domes. And I have some kind of a cartoon. I want to emphasize that the Pilbara Craton and the East Pilbara Terrane in particular is kind of the poster child for this dome-and-keel pattern, where you have granitic domes, multi-component domes, so rocks with many different zircon crystallization ages, and they've intruded and risen through and deformed a coeval supracrustal sequence. So you can see in the ages at the bottom right in the map key that the granitic rocks and the supracrustal sequences, they're actually they're rocks of the same age. So there's a volcanic sequence that's erupting at the surface at the same time that you're generating magmas deeper in the crust. And we don't really have a very clear sense, or rather there's many ideas about how this dome-and-keel map pattern formed. And that's kind of the key question that motivated me. How are these domes getting in place? What's the relationship structurally with the overlying greenstones? All right, so just to zoom into the Mt Edgar Dome, this shows you the kind of distribution of ages, and the darkest pinks are the oldest ages. The lightest pink is the youngest age at 3.2 to 3.2 or 3.28 to 3.23 billion years ago. And then there's this split rock supersuite that is this kind of M-shaped pluton in the middle left of the dome, and that's a 2.8 kind of post-doming, thought to be unrelated, completely undeformed pluton that has intruded into the dome. So something to emphasize here, most of these kind of batholithic granitic domes, they have granodiorites, tonalites, chondromites that are that range in age by about 220 million years. So this is a composite dome that is bringing together rocks of vastly different ages based on their uranium, lead of zircon. And all that geochronology work was done by the Geological Survey of Western Australia. So we have a really nice idea of the range in ages within the Mt Edgar Dome, but also within the surrounding domes. So that's important to keep in mind because, if we have this protracted history of magmatism, we want to know something about how the structures might be related to that magmatism. So here are two figures from papers now about 20 years ago. But the point of this slide is just to emphasize that a lot of the work in the Pilbara has been done on the margins of the domes in the greenstone belts. And and I'm specifically talking about the structural geology work that's been done. And there's a very clear reason for that. And that's that the greenstones are a layered rock. They show structures really well. They can metamorphose into things like schists that have a great foliation that you can measure in the field. And so a lot of the important work that's been done in the Pilbara has been focused on the greenstone belts. And comparatively little work has been done to understand the internal structure of these domes. There are some papers that have kind of, I think, mostly on the basis of that gamma ray imagery that I showed at the beginning of the talk, have mapped out broad scale structures, but very little is known about the detailed structure of these domes. So that's kind of a motivating thing for why I want to study granitic domes in the Archean, is because they're kind of they're understudied. But any model that we have for the development of these domes, it makes predictions about the internal structures. So these internal structures play a critical role in allowing us to identify, what is the process in the crust that's happening to develop the domes. So here are just three models. Kind of globally, there's been lots of models for the Mt Edgar Dome in particular. I'll just highlight these three. So convective overturn. This is a model that I think has had quite a bit of staying power in the East Pilbara in particular. And the idea is that most of the deformation, most of the dome construction is happening through overturn of the crust, where very dense mafic volcanic supersequence rocks are foundering into the crust. And in a passive response, there's deeper granitic rocks that are rising and ultimately melting and forming these domes through repeated cycles of magmatism and volcanism and foundering. Another model that's been proposed, and this one is from kind of for the Mt Edgar Dome, this is Kloppenberg et al. In 2001, is that these domes represent some kind of extensional system that could be thought of as similar to how modern day core complexes work. And so that's a very different model, very different set of predictions. And in the background here, these models are being proposed with the idea of well, what kind of tectonic setting would you need for each of these models? So for convective overturn, there's no need for plate scale lateral motion, whereas in a core complex model, you need something to create extension, whether that's extensional collapse of an overthickened crust or some kind of plate tectonic system. And then the third one that doesn't have that much popularity in the Pilbara, but has been proposed for many Archean terranes around the world, and has been in the past proposed for the Pilbara, is the idea that these domes are really kind of fold interference, and that we're looking at some kind of collisional event. So I have a figure here from a paper by Seth Kreckenberg looking at Naxos Dome in Greece. And this is a core complex. And the figure is just to kind of illustrate that different models of dome formation make very specific and distinguishable predictions for the kind of internal flow patterns that those domes should create. So a core complex like this one, you would expect kind of sub-horizontal unidirectional lineations. That's the direction of extension. Maybe a girdled foliation pattern because you're having some subdomes. And then for more of a convective overturn or diapiric type model, you'd expect that lineations are radiating from a central point of vertical constriction, and that the foliations kind of parallel the dome boundary are also kind of radiating and don't show a strong directional component. Okay, so the last kind of bit of the introduction here is just to make sure we're all on the same page, the time period that we're talking about in the early Earth, and kind of the main question that motivates a lot of this research, which is, when did plate tectonics begin? And so here we are in the Paleoarchean, and the Pilbara Craton hosts the earliest known kind of undisputed fossil life. It's stromatolites, bacterial mats. And there's been proposals that, you know, the crustal environment that the Pilbara hosted was maybe a key ingredient for having life on Earth, and how that relates to plate tectonics, whether life is integral to creating plate tectonics, or whether plate tectonics is integral to creating the setting for life, is a matter of ongoing and vigorous debate. And so whether or not plate tectonics got started in the Hadean, in the Archean, or later in the Proterozoic, one thing is very clear about the Pilbara, which is, with or without plate tectonics, the Paleoarchean marks the birth of long-lived stable continents. So while there are zircons and small fragments of crystalline rock from older, before the Paleoarchean, really we see kind of an explosion in the volume of continental crust that has survived to the present day in the Paleoarchean. And so it's an important time tectonically, whether or not plate tectonics had already gotten started. And so this question of plate tectonics, this is just one of many, many models for kind of the Earth history and plate tectonics. So I'm not necessarily endorsing this model, but the idea is that from the formation of the Earth to the present day, there must be some kind of evolution of our geodynamic system. And one idea proposed here is that there's a kind of onset of universal or global plate tectonics at about 3 billion years ago. And before that, you had more of a stagnant lid kind of major control, with maybe some intermittent subduction. Maybe plates are moving around somewhat, but you don't have a cold enough, rigid enough lithosphere to kind of maintain mobile or modern style plate tectonics. And this question and this point in time is what I'm really trying to investigate. Can we say, maybe not for the whole world, but at least for the Pilbara, what were the crustal processes, and did they necessarily involve some kind of lateral plate tectonic type motion or not? And then this slide is just to kind of say that lots of things have been proposed for different parts of different terranes around the world. And I think there's some great review papers that argue that we shouldn't be thinking that, you know, what we see in the Pilbara is necessarily representative of the entire globe. Just as today, if you randomly sampled the continents, you wouldn't necessarily be able to go to one place and say, oh, this is how the whole globe works. So there's a kind of recognition here that what I'm talking about is, I try to keep it really applied to the Pilbara, but it can help us think about some global things that might be happening. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump into kind of my approach to studying the Mt Edgar Dome. This is just a figure for those of you who are not structural geologists to get on board with what I'm talking about. if we're talking about deforming granitic rocks at high temperature, so ductile deformation, or even in the magmatic state, that deformation is going to get recorded through fabric, right? So foliation and lineation, and you can think of foliation and lineation as two components of an ellipsoidal description of fabric. And so if you only have a foliation, that ellipsoid is being flattened. If you only have a lineation, you have no foliation, so only linear alignment of minerals or linear rods of stretching, then you would get kind of constrictional or pencil-shaped fabric. And most fabrics in most places around the world are some kind of combination where you both have a foliation and a lineation. And so in the greenstone rock, so this is a picture of one of the marginal greenstone belts around the Mt Edgar Dome. Deformation is really easy to spot because the rocks are quartzofeldspathic schists and amphibolite schists, and you can see that foliation and lineation really clearly. In the Mt Edgar Dome, you can see that there is fabric, but this is what that fabric looks like in the granitoid. So you can see some alignment of these quartz blebs, for example. But you might be hard-pressed to measure the foliation and lineation in this rock, particularly because this is actually what the outcrops often look like. So you don't get a really good 3D view of fabric. You can just see that there's some alignment. And so the technique that I use to get at the orientation of fabric is called the Anisotropy of Magnetic Susceptibility. And what AMS does is it detects the alignment of magnetic minerals. So in the case of the Mt Edgar Dome rocks, the magnetic carriers are biotite and magnetite. And it gives you robust foliation lineation orientations and the fabric geometry, meaning is it flattened or constrictional. And the process is out in the field, we collect oriented samples. In the lab, we drill out those samples and we keep the orientation of the core. And then we put those oriented cores into this Kappa bridge susceptibility meter. And the Kappa bridge susceptibility meters has two coils that induce the exact same magnetic field. And the sample is lowered into one of them and spun continuously. And the difference between the two coils after the magnetization by that sample gives you the susceptibility of that sample. And so I have a little animation just to show you the measured magnetization depends on the orientation of magnetic minerals in your spinning sample. And so once you spin the sample in all 360 degrees, you get this susceptibility ellipsoid that tells you the direction K1 of most alignment, of bulk alignment of all your magnetic minerals. And you get K3, that's the minimum alignment. And we can interpret a magnetic foliation or an AMS foliation and lineation from this ellipsoid. So that's kind of the process behind collecting that data. And the AMS ellipsoid is a really rich data format. So it's not just the orientation of foliation and lineation, but also how does it deviate from a sphere, the degree of anisotropy, and then a shape parameter called T that basically tells you, is this entirely flattening, is this entirely constriction, or somewhere in between. So it gives us an idea of the relative shape of fabric. All right, so this is what there are 3 stations of data. So across the Mt Edgar Dome, I've analyzed over 1,000 individual core specimens, and those core specimens were collected at 153 stations across the Mt Edgar Dome. And so we usually try to collect, roughly 10 specimens per station. Sometimes a little less, sometimes it's a little more. And that's just to do the statistics on the AMS. But on the left here are equal area nets of the results. So the squares are K1, the circles are K3 or the pultifoliation, and K2 is the intermediate AMS ellipsoid. And so this is just a normal equal area net showing you the orientation of magnetic fabric. And I've superimposed foliation that contains K1 and K2. And then on the right, you can see shape parameter T on the y-axis versus anisotropy degree Pj on the x-axis. And it shows you that there's a range of fabrics, from oblate fabrics all the way to prolate fabrics. So we inspect each one of these results just to make sure that before we take the mean AMS ellipsoid, which is what we'll plot on a map, that we have pretty good agreement between all our individual core specimens. Okay, so I'm going to present the AMS data. I'm just going to quickly reorient you to this map. So the oldest units are the Kalina and Tambina supersuites. We're going to lump those together. And so those are 3.47 to 3.42 billion years ago. That's their uranium lead zircon age. And all the way to the youngest unit, which is the Cleveland supersuite, which is in the middle, the central north part of the dome. And that's that begins intruding, or the uranium lead zircon age begins at 3.28 billion years ago. And this is just a map of basically all the AMS data for the Mt Edgar Dome. And I'm going to break it apart into looking at the lineation, looking at the foliation. But I've plotted the on the left of the equal area nets. That's the K1 lineation, and it's broken out by age, basically, the Cleveland, Emu Pool, and Kalina Tambina supersuites. And on the right-hand area nets, that's the pole to foliation, also broken out by age. And on the left, you have the lineations plotted on a map, and it's colored by plunge. So I'm colorblind, so I can never remember it's yellow or green, but the lighter color is basically subhorizontal, and the dark blue is subvertical. So you can get a really clear sense of the plunge of lineation. And on the right, it's now colored, it's strike and dip of magnetic foliation. It's now colored by dip. So again, the yellow is subhorizontal dip, and the blue is subvertical dip. So let's start with the lineation. I think there's some clear patterns that you can pick out. I'm going to start at the bottom with the Tambina supersuite. You can see on the map that there's kind of two lobes. There's a larger lobe to on the very west end of the dome, and that has sub-horizontal lineations pretty consistently. And then there's a lobe that's on the southwest margin of the dome, and that has more variable but moderately plunging lineations. But overall, within each of those lobes, there's a pretty consistent orientation. The Emu Pool supersuite has the most kind of variable orientation. And so you can see that in the equal area net. But when you look at the map, you see that they're geographically quite well ordered. So points that are near each other have the same orientation. And so basically in the equal area net, what you're looking at is the Emu Pool has a lot of structures going on. Different parts of the dome have different orientations. And then in the Cleveland supersuite, for the lineations, you see that it's actually the simplest and most uniform pattern, and it's kind of subvertical to moderately plunging to the northwest. And if you look at the map, what you can see is there's kind of a radial pattern of lineations within the Cleveland supersuite, where lineations are all pointing to kind of this zone with the skinniest part of the Cleveland supersuite exposure. So here's the magnetic foliation, and starting from the oldest, again at the bottom, you see that there is also this, the two lobes have different orientations, and the Emu Pool supersuite, you have, again, the most variability. But when you look in the Emu Pool supersuite, rocks that are close together have kind of similar orientation. So there is a real kind of dome scale pattern here. It's just that Emu Pool seems to have different parts of the dome being different structures. And then in the Cleveland supersuite, again, you have the most kind of uniform, simple pattern of the three units. And that's foliation that's subvertical and strikes northwest, southeast. We can also plot the data by the shape parameter T. So in this case, red indicates prolate or constrictional deformation, so only has a lineation. And the darker blue indicates flattening, so it only has a foliation, does not have significant lineation. And what you can see here, if you were to kind of combine it with the orientation map, is that the Mt Edgar Dome has two places where there's a relatively high concentration of constrictional or lineation-only fabric. And there's a vertical one in the Cleveland supersuite, and there's a horizontal lineation that's a constrictional fabric in this southwest portion of Emu Pool rocks, and that's the Jarina granodiorite. And so, and then the rocks around the edge tend to have a little bit more flattening strain. There's probably a bit of a mineralogy bias to the shape because that also overlaps with the difference between magnetite-bearing and biotite-bearing samples, but not totally. So we think that there is a real aspect of this variation in strain geometry. So I'm going to take a few slides to kind of summarize the big structural observations that I want to highlight. So there's an area in the Cleveland that's kind of dominantly prolate and subvertical, and there's a radiating lineation that plunges towards that central point. At the southwest margin, we can actually see that there is a fold structure as part of the Tampina supersuite, fig tree gneiss, and that fold structure is revealed by the AMS foliation. And we can also see it in that gamma ray imagery that I showed at the beginning of the talk. So that's kind of gives us some confidence. We saw that fold structure. We're hoping to see that actually bears out, and it does in the AMS data. So the Tampina supersuite is folded on a large scale here. In the other lobe of the Tampina supersuite, it's a little less clear. We think that we can see that there is a large scale fold structure, and we get this nice central zone where that's where we can actually see the hinge going across the hinge of that fold as the foliation rotates around. So this part of the Tampina supersuite we think is also folded to some degree. And then there's this central zone in the Jarina granodiorite and the surrounding canal of the granodiorite and into the fig tree gneiss that where the lineations trace out this arch structure. And so you have equal area nets of that arch structure on the left, and then my cartoon from our 2021 paper on the right, showing our interpretation of what we think is happening. So you have horizontal lineations that plunge slightly towards the margin in the southwest and plunge slightly towards the center of the dome in the northeast. One of my goals going back to Western Australia this past summer was to go and kind of verify what this structure actually looks like, because there's a lot of interpretation to the shape based on the data that we have. And so this year we have a bunch of new AMS data from the Jarina Arch, and it really does have this amazingly consistent lineation, and it does have a sub-horizontal foliation in the center, but it gets to be a kind of steep foliation that strikes parallel to the Jarina Arch towards the margin. The other thing we discovered is that right at the very tip of the Jarina granodiorite, the GSWA has mapped a bunch of kind of fault contacts between these different units. And actually, we do see a step change. It goes from moderately plunging to, pretty steeply plunging right at the southwest margin of the Mt Edgar Dome. So we do think that there's been some modification way toward the southwest of this map area. But some things to note, we can verify because these are all very prolate fabrics in the Jarina granodiorite. So we verified that this really does have very strong preferred orientation in the lineation. The foliations are girdled, but tend to be moderately dipping to the northwest. And then just to add in, I've done a bunch of work in the greenstones immediately to the west of here, and they are highly constrictional in their fabric. So I'm not going to show that today, but that's something to kind of think about as we're thinking about the relationship between this structure and the overlying greenstones. Another place I want to highlight, because you really can't see the data at the scale of the whole Mt Edgar Dome, is in the southeast margin. There's the Wallana granodiorite, which is interesting in that it's just one of a few units that actually was intruded into the greenstone rocks outside of the shear zone that kind of wraps the margin. So the shear zone is coming to the west of the Wallana pluton, and the pluton itself is surrounded by greenstones. And so this was actually originally interpreted as a post-kinematic pluton, and its uranium-lead zircon date was held up as a kind of bracketing of the age. We knew that the shearing at the margin of the Mt Edgar Dome must have ended before this pluton intruded. And the pluton dates to just about 3.3 billion years ago. What we've discovered is, one, it has a very strong preferred alignment in the AMS fabric. So that immediately makes you question, well, is this actually a deformation fabric, or is it a magmatic flow during intrusion, which is also possible? I'll talk about microstructures across the dome in a little bit, but the takeaway here is the microstructure shows significant recrystallization of both feldspar and quartz. So here's a full thin section photomicrograph of one of the samples from this pluton, and you can see you still have plagioclase laths that you can see that are magmatic. They're prismatic, but in between them, all of the fine-grained recrystallized stuff, that is feldspar. And so feldspar is recrystallizing, and quartz, the larger grains that go from white to black, you can see that those are also recrystallizing. Some areas have really big quartz grains, but there are lots of areas where that quartz is actively recrystallizing at the time that the fabric was forming. So that makes us think that this is actually probably a synkinematic pluton that is recording the shearing at the margin of the dome at about 3.3 billion years ago. The last thing to say is, if the lineation is taken as the direction of shearing on the margin, then the shearing direction on this southeast margin is very subhorizontal, which will kind of come back when I talk about my thinking about the tectonics. Just a note, this 3.3 age for deformation along the Mt Edgar Dome margin, we have a paper that came out this year that was lutetium, hafnium, and samarium, neodymium garnet ages from samples within a range of places along the dome margin. And what we found was kind of two age populations. There's a 3.4 billion-year-old age population of garnets, but then the more common one is 3.3 age population, and that's the lutetium hafnium ages. And the garnets with different relationships to fabric, pre-kinematic, synkinematic, post-kinematic, they all have this shared 3.3 garnet age. And so we've interpreted that to say, the main dome formation shearing event at the margin of Mt Edgar Dome was happening right around 3.3 billion years ago. And so that's consistent with the Wallana pluton being a synkinematic pluton. All right, so altogether, the illustration of structures that we have so far shows this kind of dome-wide coherent structure where Emu Pool and Tambina supersuite rocks were deforming kind of variably, probably due to internal flow. And then the Cleveland supersuite, the youngest one, is coming in. It has kind of one uniform fabric towards the end of dome formation. But we'd really like to know what the conditions of deformation are. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it here, but in our 2021 paper, we did kind of a big survey of granite microstructures, and there's quite a range, but we broke it out into a few different microstructures that we could recognize. And so we found microstructures that are magmatic, submagmatic, high temperature solid state. High temperature solid state really means we see lots of evidence for recrystallization. Submagmatic is mostly we're looking for K feldspar and quartz films, and that's kind of an indication that that there was melt present in that fabric. And so, so yeah, I can step through. So some evidence for melt present deformation, and these are probably low percentages of melts, but there are places where the quartz feldspars have cracked, and quartz from a neighboring grain actually continues into that feldspar. The quartz grains don't show significant evidence for recrystallization, and the feldspar laths are actually aligned, which indicates that they're aligning in some kind of flow where they can move around because there's melt present. And then for melt present, or for high temperature deformation, we can see quartz recrystallization, sometimes feldspar recrystallization, but often we still see some of that evidence for submagmatic deformation. And so there is a potential that we're looking at a submagmatic fabric that then continues to deform into after the subsolidus as it cools. And so just to kind of give a very brief synopsis, what we see is that there's significant evidence for melt present deformation across the dome. There are places where really all you can see is high temperature solid state deformation. But we think that the AMS fabric is probably picking up magmatic, submagmatic, and a little bit of solid state deformation. And that explains why the rocks in the field don't actually look that deformed, right? Because you don't see a lot of really stretched quartz or other things that from a field perspective would kind of indicate to you that there's a really strong fabric. And so just from the structures, I kind of think that the picture that's evolving is that there was melt-assisted flow of granitic units at about 3.3, and that increasingly, I think that the later 3.28 billion-year-old Cleland was really not as involved with this kind of melt-assisted flow, and that it came in right towards the end. There's a zone of upwelling right at that in the Cleland, right at the end of dome formation, but also a zone of constrictional lateral flow, and we get some sense of the direction of flow at the margin from the Wallina Pluton. So we have the overall structure, we have the general conditions, but what we don't have yet is real kinematics, so sense of shear on any of these fabrics. And this is going to be crucial going forward for taking what is now, I consider, kind of hypotheses and trying to flesh them out. And the way that we're doing that, and this is new work, and so I'm just going to show you a little bit of pilot data from just a few samples. We're going to broaden this out to a much bigger scale. But I'm going to run through how we're doing it and some basic results. So we're using electron backscatter diffraction and a technique called crystallographic vorticity analysis. And what electron backscatter diffraction data gives you is the orientation of the crystal lattice at tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of points across a thin section. So you can really map out the orientation of crystals. You can construct grains based on the angular difference between neighboring pixels. And then crystallographic vorticity analysis basically fits an axis that describes the dispersion in the orientation for each grain, and then does a contouring of the vorticity axis for every single grain in the thin section. And that's your kind of final result. And so what it gives you is a vorticity vector, and which is the pull to the shear plane. So I have that kind of illustrated down here at the bottom. And so it's a tool that doesn't give you the shear direction, but the pull to the shear direction. And so it allows us to at least get a sense of how are these granites flowing? Are they flowing vertically or horizontally? And so the workflow here is that we collect AMS data that allows us to look at understand the orientation of fabric. We then cut thin sections parallel to that fabric. We collect EBSD data, and then we can rotate that EBSD data back into the geographic reference frame so that we can look at the orientation of vorticity vectors across a map view. While we're in the fabric reference frame, we can also look at things like crystallographic preferred orientation, which can sometimes give you some kinematic information as well. So here's an example of a sample that we did EBSD on, and I'm just going to show you just the electron backscatter diffraction data for quartz. So I'm overlaying that now. So this is what one of our maps might look like. And we can construct a crystallographic preferred orientation, where these are the quartz C, A, and M axes on the left. And then on the right here, the crystallographic vorticity axis. And when we plot that up, I think a couple things are apparent, which is that you do get a clear crystallographic preferred orientation, CPO pattern. And so as we do this, some of them give some hint at some kinematic information, so that's going to be really useful. But the CVA axes don't really, there isn't a consistent orientation, and it's not until you put them into their geographic reference frame. So now these are like sterionets instead of in the fabric reference frame, where you can see that the vortices tend to be subvertical to moderately inclined. And so this is just a pilot data. A lot more data needs to be collected to understand this. But for now, what we're seeing is that in the granodiorite, there's subvertical vorticity, which indicates horizontal flow. And that's consistent with the AMS data that we're getting. And then on the margins of the Drina arch, you get kind of moderately plunging vorticity, which indicates moderately plunging flow. And that's consistent actually with flow that's moderately plunging towards the Mt Edgar Dome margin. So also consistent with our AMS data. So we do think that as we pull this data together, we're going to get a really nice sense of kinematics and actual like kind of flow sense of shear at critical places around the dome. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to wax philosophical a little bit about my thinking about the Mt Edgar Dome and its place in our discovery of when plate tectonics started. I think the takeaway here is that the Mt Edgar Dome actually has elements of both what would be predicted from a convective overturn and a core complex development type structure. So on the convective overturn, you do have, especially in the Cleveland supersuite, you do have radiating lineation from a central point of constriction. You do have subvertical boundary parallel foliations in some places. For the core complex model, you do have a pretty big region of the dome, the Drina arch, that has subhorizontal unidirectional constrictional lineations and girdled pole to foliation. And in the Wallina, you actually have lineations that are subhorizontal and kind of parallel to what's in the Drina arch. So there is some element of unidirectional shearing that you'd expect from a core complex. So forgive my very terrible cartoons, but this is just kind of my proposed mechanism. I think that there was probably crustal extension at 3.3 billion years ago, and that crustal extension served to mobilize the entire deep crust and begin to concentrate it into domes. I want to point out that there is a pre-3.3 deformation history in the greenstone. So this isoclinal fold cartoon that I've drawn kind of shows that, that I'm not addressing with this model at all. So then the greenstone fabrics formed during this 3.3 event, and that is corroborated by the garnet geochronology. And they are really lineation dominated in most places. And so they're kind of being stretched as the dome rocks come up. And then magnetism ultimately continued after extension, and that's the Cleveland magnetism. And that served to kind of inflate some of these domes and invert the sense of shear in places where the greenstone belts were being pinched in between the margins of domes. And there's a paper from 2022 where we kind of show that happened in the Warwoona greenstones. And so the early Earth crust was probably thermally weakened on a broad scale, and dome deformation is a really efficient way to cool that. And so the thought I'll leave you with is just, what do I think about plate tectonics happening in the Pilbara? Well, I think that this study or any single study is not going to be really diagnostic, especially in structural geology. Right, there are people investigating plate tectonics from geochemistry question. That's a lot more potentially fruitful in terms of the diagnostics. But what we are showing is that there is probably significant horizontal extension. And that horizontal extension has a constrictional component, which is something that you see in domes that are forming under constriction. And there's a kind of lingering question of, well, what is that extension? Is the extension low magnitude enough that it could just be extensional collapse? Or is it at a sufficient magnitude that we have to consider some kind of horizontal lithospheric scale plate tectonic process? So from my point of view, we need a much better understanding of not just any one dome, but whole dome systems and their structural patterns and their temporal evolutions. And so I'll kind of leave you with this, that I've done a study on the Mt Edgar Dome, but there's other domes in the Pilbara, and there's this question, like, if the crust was happening under extension, shouldn't there be similar kinds of structures in these dome systems that would genetically relate the two domes? A convective overturn model might predict that really actually each of these domes has its own internally controlled structure. And so that's kind of one future avenue of my research. All right, I will end there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Really cool work to see. The detail and orientations was awesome. So we'll switch to questions and discussion. So there's a couple ways you can ask a question. You can find the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, click that, and then there's a raise hand button at the base of that pop-up. Or you can type your question into the chat and I can read it aloud for you. So I'll give some time there. Is Seilal, are you trying to,
Yeah, I'm trying to ask a question.
Okay, go right ahead. Go ahead, please.
Okay, first of all, I must say I have been delighted to hear this study. This is a sort of very sophisticated return to Hans Klooster's studies in Drachenfels, near Bonn, in the Riesengebirge, along the boundary of Poland and Czechoslovakia today, and the rhyolitic domes in Western Turkey that was done by Erinç. Now, what I would like to ask is the following. You have numerous ages on the minerals. How do they relate to the structure? Because it looks as if you have complex flow patterns within the pluton. And to me, this looks like a single pluton rising, picking up stuff from the surrounding rocks, I think, I hope, and there's a tremendous amount of shear along the margins. You know, some of the folds along the margins looks as if they have been greatly sheared. They may have had horizontal fold axes, but now they've all become vertical. Would there be some response from the speaker?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I would say is our geochronology and the structure are right now not perfectly linked, because what we have, like, there aren't very many examples where we've found zircon rims, for example, that might give us a hint of when deformation is happening, if there's some melt, new melt present or something like that. So I'll just caveat my response with, we don't know for sure the relationship between the structure and the magmatism. What my guess is that a lot of the structures in both the Tambina and Emu Pool formed at one time. So Emu Pool magmatism, which, it's all of these ages range 30 million years or something. But during Emu Pool magmatism, I think that you're actively flowing the deep crust, and the Tambina supersuite is already there, and it's getting folded up against the margin of the dome. And there's significant shearing, mostly accommodated by greenstones on the margin on the granitic greenstone contact. For me, in my mind, the geochronology, which came after this AMS study of the garnet geochronology, originally I had interpreted that the Cleland might be the thing that's driving the main dome forming event. But I think now that we know that 3.3 is really the main age of fabric development on the margin, and reinterpreting the simple pattern that you get in the Cleland, I think the Cleland is basically a Pluton that's coming in. It's maybe inflating the dome a little bit, but it's not really involved in that developing the main dome structures. Those flow structures are probably 3.3 in age. So that's despite the fact that the Tambina is more like 3.4 in its uranium-lead zircon age. It's coming along the ride and being deformed.
Thank you. But this is a fantastic study.
Thank you.
My congratulations to your team and to my old friend Basil.
Okay, cool. Several thank yous in the chat, and then we have one here, hand up from Walter Mooney. Please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, good morning, everyone. For those of you in North America, thank you, Nicholas, for a great talk, very stimulating. The present day Pilbara is about 30 kilometers thick, but our seismic measurements of Archean cratons around the world indicate that some get as thick as 60 kilometers, like in the Baltic Shield and elsewhere. Therefore, it's possible in your evolutionary model, there was a phase of thicker crust, and the modern day 30 kilometers is where it has ended up. But it could have gone through a magmatic or tectonic phase of much greater thickness, double the thickness even. That's my comment.
Yeah, and I will respond to say absolutely. There's been some pretty cool work coming out of GSWA. They just did an active seismic line, and it ends right over the Mt Edgar Dome. And what they basically found is not only is the total thickness of the crust 30 kilometers or something, which they already knew from more passive seismic stuff, but the granite greenstone terrain itself only extends down to about 15 kilometers right now, and there's other stuff below it. And so there is the suggestion that what we're looking at now, what we thought was an unmodified lithosphere, is actually more like a shallower slice of unmodified Archean crust, and we don't know what the deeper parts of the crust looked like at that point. So it's totally possible that there was a time when the crust was a lot thicker, which just is, when you work in the Archean, it just adds to that sense of things are not very constrained, right? There's a lot of possibility in interpreting.
Yes, thank you. One quick question. Is there any evidence for how much has been eroded off the top in the history of this region? Is it lost about 4 kilometers or 3 kilometers of?
The current exposure of the granitic rocks is probably about like 8 kilometers.
Okay.
Yeah, and throughout the later Archean and in the Phanerozoic, it's been buried up to like 10 kilometers and then back down. This Fortescue, which is the gray on the right, that's an unconformity at 2.7. So this was at the surface at 2.7. The Fortescue basalts got erupted onto it, buried up to 6, 7 kilometers. That's eroded down. There's Cambrian sandstones then that built a Phanerozoic sequence that's been scraped off by glaciers. So yeah, there's a whole kind of history there.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Very informative.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think Tim Kuski, did you want to ask?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. And first of all, Nick, I think that was a fantastic talk. And it's like the most detailed structural geology I've seen of Mount Edgar for a long time, going back to the days of like Stan White from decades ago. But now it's improved with new technologies, and your advisor Basil, who is also my good friend from a long time ago. So congratulations on good talk. Really mentally stimulating. So I wanted to ask about two things. One is like Terrane mentioned, you're working on this Mt Edgar pluton, basically, that it brings up older gneiss complexes going back to billions of years. If you go to like the Shaw batholith dome complex just to the southwest, you have another rock unit called the Weber Gabbro ultramafic complex that looks kind of ophiolitic. It's about 3.4, 3.49 or something, or 3.5 or something like that, billion years old. It's much older. And it's isoclinally folded into naps that are then deformed. And then they're deformed again. And then they're deformed by the Mulgandina shear zone again to make the domes rise up, along with individual magmatic intrusions along each one. So you're a young scientist just finishing your PhD and starting first job. So I have just a suggestion that we kind of think together to solve the scientific problem of the greenstones. You said they're the same age, but the older ones are a bit older, and they're incorporated into the intrusions, and they have a accretionary type structure. But we're only dealing in your talk with the eastern Pilbara, 200 by 200 kilometers. Then we go to the central and the western Pilbara, which are linear tectonic belts. How would you like to relate all of these different tectonic events that of similar ages together in the future? Okay, stop there.
That's a great point. So yeah, so I kind of skirted this question of the very early phases of what is creating the first phase of deformation in the greenstones, because I think what this study is talking about here is really something that's happening pretty late in the formation of the Pilbara Craton. So yeah, I think it's very important to then work backwards as best we can. And yeah, the Shaw is a really interesting place because it does have that, it has a strike slip shear zone on its western boundary, but it also has these complicated, potentially duplex structures in the northwest. I think that's where you're talking about, right? The Northwest Shaw. And yeah. I think that looking at these dome and keel belts as systems rather than going to one place and looking, kind of mapping one area and then going and mapping another area, which, full disclosure, is exactly what I did here, right? But building out to think of the East Pilbara as a potential system and looking at greenstone granite, not just at the margin of one dome, but kind of looking at those structures. There's been tons of amazing structural geology work in the greenstones, right? The whole Utrecht group.
So I would backtrack from your answer when you say potential maps and potential folding. They're extremely well documented. In our paper in 2021, 22, I forget, we reported everything, all the structural work, and they're
right.
Early maps refolded twice, and then refolded the third time by the Mulgandina shear zone. So it's clear. So we have to put it all together. You're doing fantastic work. And
Yeah.
your chronology and the AMS you're doing with the anisotropy can all come together. So I'm really impressed by your work. I have to compliment you greatly.
Thank you.
All right, great. I don't see any
Oh, one more
hands up
question.
here. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So you mentioned the new seismic profile. So I'm quite familiar with that, and also the other geophysics. So it shows that Mount Edgar is kind of like a horizontal unit. You can't see internal structure within it at all, but it goes down
Right.
to about 30 kilometers, and you can only see the horizontal reflectors because it's a reflection profile. But the EMU pool
Right.
goes down to about 40 kilometers, including it beneath Fortescue and stuff like that. So it'll be really nice to talk together and link the geophysics and the structural geology and the field mapping to really go progressively forward on it.
Yep, agreed.
Mm.
All right.
Okay.
Dave Evans.
I'll be quiet well.
Okay.
Thank you, Nicholas. Great talk. I really enjoyed that. A question I had about the horizontal structures is that depending on the depth of exposure, it doesn't seem to me that horizontal fabrics are necessarily inconsistent with some aspects of a domal geometry as the flow fields rise up and then they
Right.
head down toward the margins. So the question that I have is, if you're going to look at a possible extensional model, thinking about the East Pilbara as a whole, so more broadly, maybe going back to your regional map of the granite greenstone terrain, an extensional model would make predictions that we should see traces of faults where they're not being covered up by younger strata. So if you're going to posit an earlier episode of extension or potentially core complex formation, where would you like to put the possible detachment faults that accommodate that kind?
Yeah, this is a great question. A couple things. Oh, actually, I'll go back. So it's not necessarily just the horizontality that makes me think like, okay, there's something different happening. It's the fact that it's like almost pure constriction. So it's a lineation dominated fabric, which if what you're doing is flowing granites up to the roof of a dome, and then they're kind of spreading laterally, what you'll get is flattening fabrics. So it's really that constriction that's kind of distinguishing it in my mind from something that otherwise I would say, yeah, maybe it's a zone of lateral flow. So that's the first thing. And then, I mean, really what I'm imagining is that the Cleland is involved in an episode of inflating and changing the geometry of a lot of the granite greenstone interface. So, I said inflating. That's in the Pluton world that means something very specific, but I mean just generally, there's a lot of volume being put into these domes that's post kind of internal dome flow is my interpretation. So I think that the margins of these greenstone belts are a kind of modified, they are detachment faults no matter what your interpretation of the dome formation is, whether they are large scale core complex style detachment faults or some composite like kind of dipyric-gneiss dome that got started as a proto detachment fault. That's kind of where my thinking is right now. I mean, the greenstones along the Warwoona they get to be ultramyelinites. So there is extreme deformation right along this margin, but not everywhere, right? So it's like up here, not so much. They're deformed, but they're not myelinites. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of punting, but I would say the granite greenstone interface would be that proto detachment that then gets modified as maybe buoyancy forces are taking over a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. And just for a quick follow-up, so when you're showing this map, do you predict then any structures to extend to the southeast or to the northwest into some of the other adjacent, would you see a continuity of detachment structures into the other domal areas? Or do you see these as detachment faults that are kind of like mini half grabens that are on the scale of the secondarily produced domes?
So kind of where I'm going next is the other two domes that are well exposed enough to do AMS at many, many locations are the Carina Downs and Shaw. And so my thought here is I can make predictions if this was all, maybe not in this exact configuration, but if this was all kind of an extensional lower crust that coalesced into these domes, then you should see those extension features on the dome margins, but also similar kind of Shaw doesn't have Cleland and Carina Downs also doesn't have any Cleland. So they are basically all Emu Pool and older. And actually Shaw is mostly the Tambina and Kalina. So you're going to see, hopefully, that there are structures that relate each of these domes. And that would be an indication that, like, okay, this is a crustal-wide system, as opposed to if we see just completely different structures in each of these domes, we need to kind of rethink, like, oh, actually, these domes, the structure is really being formed by the emplacement and flow patterns that are not being dictated by an external extension kind of thing.
Good. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, Christoph, would you like to go ahead?
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Just a short comment from the perspectives of the Barberton Greenstone Belt. Nick, what a wonderful study. I think from what we see in South Africa in the Carp Val on the other side of the plutons, that is within the volcano sedimentary basins of the Barberton Greenstone Belt, is exactly the complexity that you have shown us here. A rapid change in dynamic patterns and boundary conditions that is then reflected in the volcanic and the sedimentary fill of the Barberton Belt. So I would wish someone would do similar work on the plutons adjacent to the Barberton Belt. Great talk.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We don't have, oh yeah, so someone in the chat, by the name of Dennison, asks, for evidence of extension and extent of formation, there is the Kelly dike swarm and related flood basalts at 3.32 GA. It's immediately adjacent to the west of the Mt Edgar, and which are themselves not particularly deformed. The dikes are vertical and linear, so the crust wasn't that squishy in that area at the time. Maybe it wasn't phrased as a question, but would you like to respond to the comment?
Oh, yeah. I'm actually not familiar with those, so that's great to hear as a comment. One of the things that I've struggled with personally in thinking about how to interpret these is that now, right, at the end of dome formation, the greenstones and granitic rocks are juxtaposed. And so the greenstones are traveling through a lot from the upper crust down to the deep crust. And it's pretty hard to unravel what, for any given structure, where are you looking at in the process? Geochronology is a huge problem in the greenstones, just in terms of dating actual structures. We've done it a little bit with the garnets. So that's great to, I don't know much about those dikes, but that may be something that there are lots and lots of dikes that cross-cut the greenstone belts, and have someone doing a study where they look at dike orientations and try to restore them in the context of one of these proposed hypotheses would be awesome. Yeah.
All right, thanks. The next one in the chat from Karthik Sender Sarwan. Is the Coriolis force significant enough to affect the kinematics and vorticity of the dome fabrics?
I don't have the expertise for this, but I'm going to say no. I think probably this is happening at too high of a viscosity for that kind of very small force to play a major role. But I have never considered that.
Okay. Cool. So thanks everyone for the questions. Maybe I'll leave just a few seconds in case someone wants to speak up. All right, it's not a bad time to cut it anyway because you're going to be teaching soon. So thanks a bunch, Nick, for this. It was really impressive, all the data you were able to show and get out of this. So really cool stuff.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me.
Great
Thanks.
talk.
All right.
And I guess we switch to low temperature stuff next week.
Yeah. Cool. All right, everybody, take care and see you next week.
All right. Yep.